How's everybody doing? Good stuff. Coming up with new ones. Hey, so we are we got a little break here between Advent and our stewardship series, and so I figured we should probably just take a few weeks to talk about Thanksgiving and what it means to be thankful, and what Thanksgiving does for us is what we'll talk about today, and then what Thanksgiving looks like in us is what we'll talk about next week. And so we're going to be in the famous passage on Thanksgiving, Leviticus. This is, I know, where you always go when you're thinking about Thanksgiving, Leviticus chapter 7. So this is it's about a ritual. And so it begins like this in verse 11. It says, "These are the regulations for the fellowship offering anyone may present to the Lord." And so real quick, the idea of offering, the Old Testament has a lot of different offerings, a lot of different sacrificial systems, a lot of different festivals, and all these different regulations are on all of them, and they all look a little different. There's a lot of them. We talked about Passover last week, right? And so it had a specific way to cook, a specific way to eat, what to eat, all these rules around it. And so we could run through all of them. It's not completely necessary, but why is it the idea of sacrifice? Because it's not unique to the Jews, right? It's not like this isn't a new idea that was just kind of Jewish, right? But sacrificial systems had been around as early as we have documents. As far as some of them were not friendly sacrifices, right? There were human sacrifices, children, virgins, right? This whole idea was that if we sacrifice, we'll keep the gods happy. That was the way it worked. It was like, well, if we sacrifice the right things, then the gods of this or the gods of that, they'll be happy with us, and then good things will come to us. And but it's interesting, right? Because that's such a deep idea that if we give up something now, we can gain something better in the future. Like, as humans, we're like the only people that can, or the only animals, creation, that can really see into the future to go, if I could sacrifice something now, I can get something better in the future. Like, that's what work is, right? Work is literally giving up the hours in the middle of your day in the hopes that it'll be worth it in 2 weeks on payday or on retirement day, or we're giving up time now for something we think is worth it. Because listen, if there was no paycheck, how many of us are not going to work on Monday, right? So yeah, Peggy said she's done. So there's this whole idea like sacrifice, and so it works even being, and not just going to work, right? But it's if you work hard at your job, right? If you make a good sacrifice, we talked about this a few months ago, making good sacrifices produce a better fruit. And if you made a good sacrifice by what it produces. And so it's like even with investing, right? When you invest money, you're giving up a chunk of money you have now and putting it away where you can't have it in hopes that if you made a good and large investment, you will benefit from it in the end. Like, that is the reason for sacrifice. That is the definition. So what then would be if good sacrifices produce good returns, what is the greatest sacrifice? And so this is how some of these, if you have a God that does not give you rules around sacrifice in your head, you would go, well, what's the greatest sacrifice? Well, the greatest sacrifice has to be the thing that is most important. And you see how they end up with some of these terrible sacrificial systems. Because they go, what's the most important thing? It's, well, my children. Well, then you have to sacrifice the thing most important to you so that you can get the most important benefits, right? And so if you don't have a God who's saying that these are things you can't do or shouldn't do, then you can understand how these systems kind of come into place. And so, like, what's the famous one? It's Abraham and Isaac, right? And so we hear this story and we go, I can't believe that God would ask that of Abraham. And it's like, but we have this thing, I think C.S. Lewis calls it chronological snobbery. Are you familiar with that? But it's that we look at first century or BC times with this 21st century lens. And we go, I can't believe something like that would happen. But understanding that Abraham, would have likely come out of a system where child sacrifice was normal. And so he comes into this. And so what I find, because if you don't know the story, right, God calls Abraham to sacrifice the son that he has, who's the fulfillment of the promise that's going to be, God's blessing to the whole world is all going to come through Isaac. And God goes, you got to sacrifice him, right? And so we're thinking that's a crazy idea, but in fact, what we'll find is that in that story, we're not going to go through that story today, but God at the onset of the Jewish movement of the Hebrew people says we actually don't do this. This actually isn't an okay sacrifice, and he lines up the way that sacrifices ought to work. So what then? It's a long way of saying. So what is a fellowship offering then? So what is a fellowship? And it's not sacrificing those that you're in fellowship with. All right? Don't sacrifice your friends. All right? That's not Alyssa was ready. So a fellowship sacrifice is a sacrifice that you actually get to share with those you're in fellowship with. All right, so most sacrifices in the Jewish system, most of them would just go to the priest and to the temple and to the Levites, and you would leave it there, and they would make the sacrifice, and they would keep it all, and you would go about your business. But the fellowship offering, the fellowship sacrifice, was one that you got to share in the sacrifice with. So you put an animal in the offering, and then you got to receive some of it. And you can look at the rest of the passage in verse 12. It continues. It says, if they offer it as an expression of thankfulness, then along with this thank offering, they are to offer thick loaves made with yeast and with olive oil mixed in, thin loaves made without yeast and brushed with oil, and thick loaves of the finest flour, well kneaded with oil mixed in. Along with their fellowship offering of thanksgiving, they are to present an offering with thick loaves of bread made with yeast. They are to bring one of each kind as an offering, a contribution to the Lord. It belongs to the priest, who splashes the blood of the fellowship offering against the altar. The meat of their fellowship offering of thanksgiving must be eaten on the day that it is offered, and they must leave none of it until morning. And so there is three types of these fellowship offerings. So you could do it in form of a vow. You could do it in the form of a thanks. So there was a vow. There's a free will offering. Sorry. Then there is a thanksgiving offering that you would do. And so you would take the choice animal from your flock, and then you, along with some bread for the priest, and they would sacrifice it, and then you would go home. You would take it, and you would have a Thanksgiving meal, right? Where it was a time where you would get together, and you would. So this was before the Pilgrims, right? Before the Pilgrims. We're doing Thanksgiving meals, all right? So if you got a problem with, I know Thanksgiving's coming up, I'm ready for it. But if you got a problem with Thanksgiving, you can always just celebrate the Jewish Thanksgiving just like this, and you can just be happy about it still, all right? Still have your turkey. I don't think you could have ham, but you could have turkey, right? So you're reminded when you eat a Thanksgiving meal, like you're reminded that you don't have everything you have just because you worked hard. You're reminded that it's not just because of what you have done or how great your year was, but there's an idea behind Thanksgiving, and this is why they would bring it to the priest, this idea to say, I have what I have because God provided something for me, because God allowed me to do the work that I can do, to earn the check that I can earn. Like that God gave all of this ability to me. And so there's a reason, though. I think it's over 235 times in the Bible the word remember is used. And if you use the root word of remember, and you can get into remembrance and all those other words, it's like another 120. And then if you throw in the do not forgets, I think you get another 50 or so. So there's this idea. It's like, why would there have to be so much attention made to remembering and not forgetting? And it's because we forget and we don't remember, right? It's like that's the reason that we have to be told things over and over and over again, especially when it comes to God. And so this idea of being thankful is one that reminds us of who it is that supplies us with what we have, who it is that allows us to have the blessings that we have. And so they sit down regularly, not just once a year, but regularly sitting down to say we are thankful for what we have. And so one of the simplest forms of thanksgiving or being thankful is actually remembering. I don't know if one of the things that I just love more than anything is if I overhear my children talking about things that they enjoyed that we did with them, where they don't know you're even listening necessarily, but they're just talking like, oh, do you remember we did this or we had that? Oh, I can't. Like inside, like me, I just going, because it's just a thankfulness, right? Because what it means is it means that my sacrifice was good, right? It means that whatever it did that we had to do to make something happen for them, that it was worth it, that it brought some value out of it. And so part of being thankful is remembering. And so you can think about when you're having a hard time, when I'll get to that in a second, but part of worship too then, right? We talked about this last week in communion. It's remembering. It's a remembering service. And so it's part of our worship is remembering and being thankful for what God has given us. And here's the thing, what's the opposite of thankfulness? Pridefulness. Right? Then when we're not thankful to others, then we're thankful for ourselves. Right? And so when we're thankful to ourselves, it's kind of like when pride starts to creep up. And the famous passage, right? Proverbs 16, it says this: pride goes before destruction, right? A haughty spirit before a fall. And so if we aren't thanking others for what we have, then we're thanking ourselves. And it's like, man, I'm so tough. I'm so hardworking. Like, I'm the reason we're here. I'm the reason our family has what they have. And it's like, actually, why aren't they thanking me more? Right? Why aren't people, when I walk in, why don't people just thank me all the time? Like my dog thanks me every time I walk in the door. They're just super excited about me being there. Right? It's like, but why don't everyone else be thankful of how hard it is? Like, that's where the prideful, you see how pride kind of raises up in that. And so when we're thankful to others, we don't have to be thankful to ourselves. And listen, the Israelites were masterful at forgetting God, and I think we are masterful at it as well. When things are good, man, we just stop thinking about God. We just start thinking about how good things are, right? And it's like it's not until we lose that which we were ungrateful for that we realize how much we had. And so we need to spend time thinking about the things that we're thankful for in life, because it affects us. It affects the way we function. It affects the pride in us, and it affects our gratefulness towards others. And so thankfulness resets our values. When we regularly take the time to be thankful for what God's given us, it humbles us and lowers that pride, right? It starts building up. And so every so often, the Israelites would gather with their closest people, and they would have these meals, these Thanksgiving meals, and to say, God, thank you. Thank you for what we have. And just, I don't know, do we do this? I grew up, we had, her name was Teresa, and she was the pastor's wife of a local church near us. And I was real close friends with her son. And after church on Sundays, she would just have a spread. You know what I mean? With fresh bread coming out of the oven. Just real meat, that we didn't go in the microwave, right? It was like this real thing, like this real meal that we all sat down, a bunch of people. He just invited people over from church or from the neighborhood and just had a meal together. It's like, do we do that still? Like, just get together and make food together? Like actually make food together. Not buy it, but hey, we made this and our love's poured in this. And then you sit around and talk and not stare at phones and just go, like, I'm thankful for you. I try so hard to have dinner at the table with our family. It's so hard with 3 teenagers, but occasionally I get one, and if I can get to the table fast enough, I'll get there before they're done eating. right? And that's my goal. I try to get to the table, at least get one spoon before they finish their food, and that's a successful dinner with my children. But this idea, these conversations around being thankful for what we have. Thankfulness, when we're thankful, we can recognize that our sacrifices were good. And this is why entitled, when we see entitled people or entitled children, that it irritates us. It's because, what does that say? It says, my sacrifice, like if I saved up all year to go on vacation, right? And all everyone did was whine and bicker and stare at phones and this whole thing. If that's all that happens, right? To me, I go, my sacrifice wasn't good. Because I spent time saving for this, right? I spent time planning this, or like anything. It doesn't have to be anything we put time and energy into. It doesn't get the result that we wished. Then we go, oh, it was a bad sacrifice. And it makes you not want to do it again, right? You're like, I don't think I'm going to do it that way again. Like, or there's going to be something different we're going to do around it next time, right? So it's part of being thankful is understanding that your sacrifice was good. And because contempt can build up if we're not thankful. If we don't time to be thankful for things, contempt builds up. Contempt. And contempt is, it's a relationship destroyer when you aren't thankful for somebody that's putting work in, that's putting effort in. You make them feel small or useless or disregarded. It's a destroyer of relationships. And so being thankful is a healer of relationships. And so we're being thankful. Thankfulness does a lot. Are you with me? Thankfulness. So that's the Old Testament. Let's jump to the New Testament for a little bit. There's a passage, which this was really cool. I saw this, and I just thought, we definitely have to share this. So in Philippians 4, this is Paul talking to the church in Philippi, and he says this. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with, what's the word? Thanksgiving. Present your requests to God. Thank you, Bob. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Do you ever get anxious? You ever get anxious? Sometimes you get anxious for good reason, right? It's like part of your chemistry. It's like I'm anxious because I have something to be anxious about. It's a big meeting. It's a first date. It's a test. It's something at work. It's a big job. A promotion or whatever. The pastor called you to her office. It's like those anxious moments, right? But sometimes you can be anxious and have no idea why you're anxious. I mean, I've had that before, and it's like you try to figure out. It's like I have no idea why I'm feeling this way, but like I'm tense, right? I'm kind of. It almost feels like you're in danger, but you don't know what from, right? And so you're looking around for trying to figure out what's wrong, and it's just an anxious feeling. I had a pastor friend. She said, and I don't know, we were a part of this pastor's group, and we would meet, and we would just kind of talk about life and pastor life, and just stuff like that. And the one time she said, I'm probably in my mid 20s at the time, and she goes, I just get anxious sometimes, and I'm going, in my mid 20s when you know everything, right? This is when I knew everything, and I said, the Bible says don't be anxious, so just stop it. Okay? She looked at me like I was an idiot, because I was, right? But it's like that's just how the simplicity of the Sunday school understanding of the Bible, right? So I'm just like, well, it says don't be anxious, so stop being anxious. Kind of that Bob Newhart skit where he's the therapist. Have you seen? You have to look it up. Bob Newhart, the therapist. She goes, I'm claustrophobic, and he's like, stop it. And it's like, that's not how it works. You can't just say stop it. So I told her, I said, just stop. And there's the thing, Paul didn't just say, don't be anxious, right? He gave something in there to replace it with, right? He said, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And now I want to read you something. Just nerd out for a second here. It's a 2015 study out of the Journal of Counseling Psychology. It's a meta-analysis of the gratitude intervention, right? Sounds super interesting. So it says this. This is the conclusion. This was cool. The science of gratitude has advanced rapidly over the last decade, and it is time to take stock regarding interventions to promote gratitude. The most common strategies for promoting gratitude: listing things for which one is grateful, journaling, or expressing one's gratitude to the person to whom one is grateful. They're simple and relatively easy to incorporate into a variety of treatment strategies. Some advocates have been hopeful that perhaps spending just a few minutes per day to turn one's mind to the social benefits of being grateful could help people avoid ruts in thinking that lead to anxiety, depression, or the symptoms that undermine mental health. And I'm just like, I love when science catches up to the Bible, right? Because the Bible's going, actually your brain struggles to have both anxiety and thankfulness at the same moment. Right, it's a conflict for your brain, and so I don't think Paul was a neurologist by any means, but he had the understanding that being thankful is a part of battling anxiety. If you're anxious, with prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, and then science goes, actually, if you're thankful, if you got to focus on being thankful, it hinders the anxiety in your. Is that amazing? I just thought maybe it's not. I thought it was amazing. The last thing, so look at this little journey with Paul real fast. I want you to look at the way that that Paul closes his first letter to the Thessalonians. All right, so this is 1 Thessalonians 5. He says, rejoice always. Such an optimist, right? So rejoice always. Pray continually. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. This isn't something he just says, though. All right? He doesn't just say, be thankful, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances. He actually lives it out. You can go to Philippians, and you can see it play out in Philippians 1. He says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters. And Paul's writing this in chains, in prison. So the guy that wrote to the Thessalonians, who said, pray continually, give thanksgiving and everything, is now in prison, writing a letter to the Thessalonians, or to the Philippians. He says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, that's a good phrase. Because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. And so Paul's in chains. Paul is locked up, writing this letter to the church in Philippi, and he's like, look at all the good. Look at all that my chains have done. I was, man, if we lived in a world where we went, look at all my chains have accomplished, instead of, look at what my chains are keeping me from. And so Paul says, be thankful in it all. Be grateful, and I'll find something. And he does, and it's not just in his writing that he's living it out. Because if you go to Acts chapter 16, it says, the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas. And the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. Be thankful. Find something to be happy about, Paul. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. Find something to be happy about, Paul. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. And it said at about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake, and the foundations of the prison were shaking, and at once all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. And the jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he had thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. And he then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in this house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them, probably a Thanksgiving meal. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. And so what have my chains accomplished? Paul would say my chains have accomplished a lot, and that he was able to be thankful even in places where there is no hope. He's able to be hopeful in places where people go to the end. And Paul, so how can we rejoice in loss? How can we rejoice in death? How can we rejoice in pain? And it's because of Jesus. It's that simple. It's because of Jesus. And Paul showed us how to do it. And so we're to be thankful in all things. And it's those things. It's the singing at midnight. It's the thankfulness in the darkness that lead others to know that we're the ones that have the peace that passes all understanding. That when we ought to be distraught, when we ought to be frightened, when we ought to be scared, when we ought to be on our last leg and wanting bailed out and curled up in a ball and not wanting to go one step further, we're the people that get to stand up with peace and strength and say, there's hope and there's strength, and it's in Christ. God bless you, church. Be thankful.